I'm gonna try not to rant in this one, but suffice it to say, I'm a little disappointed. Right off the bat, spoiler warning for both the whole show and all the books, both of them, because the show's right up to where the books ended off pretty much. So I guess we could begin by pointing out how overall there has certainly been a very significant drop in quality since the last season, but especially since the show ever began. I mean, before it used to be in it was in the good category. Now it's gone down to the still okay category, or the okay-ish category. I have like a bunch of categories, but as far as I'm concerned, the only two shows that are in the top category are like Breaking Bad and The Wire, and everything else is in another category. But this show is like going down in categories, and there's a good number of reasons why. And again, I'm not going to try to rant, but all right. Let's just talk for a moment about adaptations. Adaptations are hated amongst people who play video games, because people who play video games pretty much understand that adapting a video game is impossible. It's not something that's ever been done well. You could maybe adapt a movie into a game, but not the other way around. And you can only adapt a game into a movie if you don't really adapt the game into a movie, if you just adapt something else within the game setting into the movie rather than the game itself, because it's an interactive medium versus a non-interactive medium. Adapting movies into books and vice versa, that's also that is less bad, but that still has tons of problems. The obvious problem is that there is a loss of complexity when you adapt a book to a game, or a book to a movie. There's an inevitable loss of complexity in terms of story. The only thing you get is that there's a visual complexity you didn't have before. But there's an immense loss of character complexity, because you don't have access to the character's thoughts, you don't have access to the character's dreams, you don't have access to the character's feelings at any given point in time. You don't get access to all the little things they're thinking about. You get access to just very superficial, simplistic level of what these characters actually are, and what you get in Game of Thrones is precisely that. Every single character is a rough estimation of who their character actually is within the books. The books are the characters themselves. Like, overall, I mean, it's hard to... Like, even Tyrion isn't that accurate to Tyrion Lannister in the books, because he's still sort of a rough estimation in those terms. But that's all besides the point. As far as I'm concerned, there's only two reasons to adapt a book into a movie. The one reason, sort of the best reason, is to take all the nuances and subtleties and intricacies of the book and visualize them. Right? So if it's a very... What that means is basically you take all the little details that a book does to set up its characters, its plot, and you make them into a movie, transfer them into a visual medium. Right? Well, so that what that means is, if a character's having dreams, or if a character's having thoughts, or if a character's having certain feelings, the movie, the visual medium, should make some attempt at visualizing that. You can visualize dreams as pretty easily. It's harder to visualize thoughts and feelings, but one way to do that is through narration. One way to do that is through clever dialogue. One way to do that is through good acting, but there's tricks you can do to make that come across. The other thing, the other sort of aspect of this is you can, when you're adapting a book into a film, is to get the intricacies of the plot across. And for a plot that is basically entirely about politics and a plethora of characters and all these moving parts, the best thing to do would be to take all those moving parts and show them. But of course that would be a lot of time, that would be a lot of characters, that would be way, way, way too many man-hours, and it would be way too complicated. The only show that's done that well is The Wire. Like, I can literally see The Wire as being a book. Like, there's a few point of view characters in The Wire, You could easily take The Wire and turn it into a book. Or Wire could have easily been derived from a book, written in very much the same style as as A Song of Ice and Fire. You know, it could have had point of view characters and chapters narrated by these point of view characters. It would have all followed exactly the same. And it would have worked because The Wire actually does it justice. It has a lot of characters and a lot of complexity. Game of Thrones has nowhere near the amount of complexity that The Wire does, and that's part of the flaw of it, is because it's supposed to, because the work that it's adapting has all that complexity. And I'm sorry, I'm going to try not to sound like an angry fanboy who's read the books, but the fact is it's an adaptation. So it's an adaptation that is crucially linked to the thing that it's adapting. Okay, it's not like a movie that's adapted off of some book. I mean, that stuff is a little different, but this is the whole point of the show is to follow the books closely. And it doesn't do that, right? It doesn't get all the subtlety across. You know, watch Game of Thrones, it's nothing like The Wire. It doesn't have as many characters, it doesn't have as many subtleties and nuances. The point is, the amount of complexity that's in the books is severely truncated when making the show. They cut out a whole bunch of stuff. They cut out like 100 characters. I'm not even joking. There's literally like 100 characters that they've cut out. There's a whole bunch of subplots and plot lines that they've cut out. All this stuff. You know, you might say, of course, that's the point. No, I'm not even talking about like the dream sequences and shit that Daenerys and the other characters have. I'm just talking about raw dialogue and plot that concerns characters within the world. You know, like most of the Bannermen are completely omitted. You hear very little about half of them. The only Bannermen you really know are the Stark Bannermen, the Karstarks and the Boltons, and that's the only ones that the show actually features. All the other ones, or I guess you hear something about the Lannister. It doesn't matter. It's obvious to anyone who's read the books that, yeah, they cut out a whole bunch of characters. And you might say, well, of course they did. It's an adaptation. Well, no, that's the problem, though. The whole point, as I said, of the adaptation is to get all that across, is to take, you know, all of the politics and visualize it. And if you don't do all the politics, or if you start severely truncating a good chunk of the politics, it's no longer the same story. Okay. That's just the one reason why to adapt. The second reason why you'd want to adapt a book into a movie is if the book has a lot of visual elements that would be very cool to see on screen. It'd be cool to put that book on screen. That's another very good reason to adapt. That was one of the beautiful things about the Lord of the Rings trilogies. That the Lord of the Rings trilogy, even though they cut out a severe number of characters as well, not as many as Game of Thrones, but a pretty large number of characters and a large number of subplots, it remained a very visual story within the movies, as was the point, because it was a very visual book. And that's why it's still a very good set of movies, even though it doesn't follow the books exactly, because it adds visual depth to everything that's happening. Now, this is another thing that Game of Thrones isn't doing, because for it to be a visual story, it needs a higher budget. It needs a movie budget. It needs to, you know, have more CGI. It needs to have CGI that doesn't look bad. Now, there's some good-looking, you know, action that happens in episode 8 of season 5 with Jon at Stratholme, but everything else is pretty bad. You know, there's an animation budget that they have to spend on the dragon, and but like everything around. I've had this feeling for a long time in Game of Thrones, ever since season 3. The Game of Thrones is not really a visual show. It doesn't look good. You know, a lot of the scenes are very dimly lit. A lot of the shots are just plain boring. They're not very colorful. They're not very intricate. There's not that much prop work. There's not, you know, you don't really get to take in the setting and take in the visuals and the surroundings as you would in something like Lord of the Rings, because in Lord of the Rings they put a whole lot more work into that because they could. Here they couldn't, because it's a TV show, not a movie. But but seriously, if you don't believe me, just try compare the visuals of Lord of the Rings. Like take any shot of Lord of the Rings, compare it to any shot in Game of Thrones. You'll see the difference. It's part of the reason I noticed is that it's very dark and like dimly lit. I could go on and on about this whole thing, but there's a huge like set design and cinematography difference, which honestly points out the severe lack of budget that they have. The reason that a lot of the scenes are dimly lit and dark is because lighting them well and would be annoying because you'd have to put things within the set to make it look good, right? So keeping it dimly lit is kind of an excuse for bad set design or set design that is lacking. I feel like the show's visuals are just cheap, and they are, compared to movies that have done the same thing and better. But that's all besides the point, right? My point is, these are the two reasons you'd want to adapt, and Game of Thrones does none of them that well. I mean, it doesn't do the visual thing well, and the only thing left is the politics, but it barely does the politics well. It at least sort of did them well before, but not anymore, not after this season. I mean, I was a little optimistic after the ending of Season 4. I did a whole review about that. And Season 4 ending was actually a decent ending. But this ending was... I guess it was okay. But furthermore, the ending to this season didn't make up for the entire plot. The only plot this season that I liked was Cersei's plot. Cersei's plot was pretty much there's Cersei, Dany, and Jon's plots were essentially by the books. Cersei starts to lead the small council, and she starts making a whole bunch of bad decisions. The only issue with it was that they spent a lot more time emphasizing her scenes with Marjorie rather than decisions she made on the small council that began to ruin began to ruin their dynasty. Because honestly, that's the politics. It's the small council stuff that's the politics. The shit that happens to, like, Cersei and Marjorie's rivalry is just... It's just there, but it's not, like, the main focus. It's not all the stuff she does that's wrong. It's just one of the things. But anyway, the Cersei plot was good because of how it ended. And the way it ended was actually really good. It was basically totally by the book. And it was effective. And I was actually really proud for a second of Lena Headey because I thought that was actually her in that scene where she was walking down. But I was disappointed to find out that was actually a body double. I don't know why actors are... I don't know why actors are upset or don't really want to show themselves nude for a thing like that. Because obviously some body double was, but whatever. The point is, it was pretty effective. It was pretty well done. I was actually worried, given how the rest of the show was going, that they would somehow cheat that moment by either not showing her nude, or by covering her up, or by simply showing the top of her head, all of which would have cheapened the experience. The fact that you actually get to see her adds to the experience, because it sort of... it humanizes Cersei. Because beforehand she's been sort of dehumanized, and that was sort of what the scene did, was it humanized her. It was a pretty good scene. And the whole ending there was by the book. You know, Robert Strong comes in and picks her up. It was dramatic. It was good. There's not much more to say about that. It was okay. The rest of her plot wasn't that good. The whole thing about how Marjorie gets arrested was It didn't happen the same way in the books, and that's pretty much all there is to say about that. The other plots that happened this season weren't so good. And anyone who's read the books will tell you the same. Jaime's plot was complete and utter nonsense. There was... So Bronn isn't even in the story anymore. In the books, he just goes off and marries that chick. This was an excuse to get Bronn back into the show. It was an excuse to get Jaime to do things, because of course, what Jaime was actually supposed to do was do stuff in the Riverlands, which would set up his meeting with Lady Stoneheart. And of course, Lady Stoneheart was actually cut out from the show, and that's why Brienne never runs into her either. So that entire loss of complexity there, this is going to go into a point that I'm going to make later, but that right there shows you why they can't, why they're losing a lot by cutting out characters. You might say, well, Lady Stoneheart's not that important, but she is important because the fate of two main characters is tied into the fate of Lady Stoneheart. So by cutting out Lady Stoneheart, they have to change what happens to Brienne and Jaime. And what they end up changing it to is something really shitty. Jaime, the whole idea of the mission to Dorne was idiotic to begin with. They walk into the Water Gardens, which is completely unguarded, and they somehow sneak in, master of espionage, Jaime and Bronn, and then they have a fight, and then they barely make off with Myrcella. I mean, it was just... What did they expect to happen? Did they expect to escape with her? It probably wasn't going to happen. I don't know... Just the whole logic of it. Jaime's not an infiltrator to even think of a mission like this, let alone he's missing a fucking hand. Anyway. And then they're afraid that they're gonna be killed by Doran Martell, I guess. It was just a way to introduce Doran. Here's the thing. The whole purpose of that plot line within Feast for Crows was to introduce Doran Martell as a character and introduce Doran's role within the story. Part of this was by introducing Arianne Martell and his plan to marry her to Viserys, and the plan to have Quentyn Martell go over to marry Daenerys. But that was it. The whole point was to introduce Doran, to introduce his plans, but his children aren't even in the show. So his plans are pretty much pointless, which really makes me think what else Doran is going to do in the books, because, I mean, he's supposed to have, from what it looks like, he's going to have Arianne try to marry fake Aegon. But fake Aegon isn't in the show either. So what the heck is Dorne's role in the show going to be? It could be, and I'm actually calling this right now, that Dorne isn't going to show up again, right? It could be. Dorne might just not show up, because a whole bunch of characters have appeared and not shown up. We haven't seen anything of the Freys in the show in like 2 seasons. We haven't seen anything from... who haven't we seen? We haven't seen the Brotherhood without banners, because their whole purpose was to bring Catelyn back to life. We haven't seen them. We haven't seen... Who else haven't we seen? I don't remember who else we haven't seen, but... Oh, we haven't seen the Greyjoys in the show either. And apparently the whole Greyjoy arc was cut out as well. So, who's to say who's still in the show or not? If the Greyjoys are being cut out, and the Brotherhood without banners got cut out, and all these characters that did things got cut out, Dorne might just be cut out, and this might have just been an excuse to have Jaime do something this season. So, that was very disappointing, that whole thing. So then we have Sansa's plot, and Sansa's plot is completely off book. They amalgamated her character with Jane Poole, who in the books is impersonating Arya Stark and is being forced to marry Ramsay to solidify Ramsay's claim on the North. And Sansa basically takes her place. Now, oh god, the reason this bothers me is because whatever Littlefinger is doing is intricately related to Sansa, and the fact that he would just give her up to the Boltons like that doesn't make any sense. So, what the hell this is leading to is... I have no freaking idea. This is another example of where they're literally changing everything to accommodate a plot line. Because this severely changes Littlefinger's character. It totally changes Littlefinger's character. It totally changes Sansa's character as well. Okay? Whatever Littlefinger was planning, whatever that was in the books, is now completely non-existent in the show. It can't be existent because it's not... It can't be happening. Because unless Sansa somehow magically ends up returning to the Vale and continuing that plotline in Season 6, although I don't even want to think about that. That sounds really dumb. But yeah, here's the thing. Everything that Littlefinger has done in the books has been for a very specific reason. The reason he kidnapped Sansa, the reason he's done everything. We don't know what that is. We don't know what he's planning. But nowhere in those plans did he ever have the idea to marry her to Ramsay Snow? So the fact that this is happening flies right in the face of Littlefinger's plans, whatever they were. Which means whatever Littlefinger's plans were in the books isn't going to be in the show, which is a huge disappointment because those plans were probably very, very important, or at the very least very interesting. The other big problem with Sansa's plot, and this is a huge problem that I just noticed in the show, is the fact, and I just have a big note here, in caps, Ramsay Snow. If I could identify one big problem with the show overall, it's Ramsay Snow as a whole. The show was pretty good in seasons 1 and 2. It was very by the book, it followed the book very closely, it was very nice. Then it started to get weird, and it started to get weird around the time that they introduced Ramsay Snow. The part of it was how they introduced him. He killed some of his own men just to trick Theon and then lure him back, which was weird in itself, even for Ramsay. And then he proceeds to torture Theon all season. The problem I have with that is that it's completely different from the books. You never see Theon getting tortured. Theon is completely gone, and then you find him again, and you hear about his torture. Now, the latter is much more effective because it's a good example of showing and not telling. At least, yeah, sort of, because what ends up happening is you see just how broken Theon is, and that adds to the horror of Ramsay as a character. You're always scared of what he's going to do. It's sort of the horror of the unknown type of thing. You don't see him do these bad things. You know that he does them, and you hear some stuff about him. But that makes him very dangerous because he's sort of uncertain. And furthermore, you know Theon from before, and you know Theon now, and you see how much he's crushed Theon's spirit, which is also indicative of just the horror that Ramsay is capable of. The problem with what the show does is the show straight up shows us some of that horror, which in effect makes it less scary to us, and also makes it more repulsive. It's the whole thing where it just ends up being like Squick. It ends up being just shock value, right? Because you know Theon's getting tortured, and he's getting tortured for a bit, and then some more, and then some more, and that's all that's really happening throughout season 3. I think Theon's doing nothing but getting tortured. It would have been so much more effective to not show any of that and just have Theon reappear as a complete screwed up emotional wreck, to just have us imagine what he could have gone through. It was way more effective. Showing it to us is just repulsive. It's the whole thing. It's the whole thing that I talked about before, where any type of violence has to justify itself, and this was not self-justified violence. This was just, let's make it dark and edgy because this is Game of Thrones and things have to be dark and edgy. But no, things don't have to be dark and edgy. In fact, a lot of the dark and edgy things within the books are things you hear about peripherally, not things you actually see. The show has this weird obsession with actually showing us the things that you hear about, because it thinks that showing us to them is going to make them feel worse, but in effect what it does is make them it makes them worse from a storytelling point of view, and not as bad from a dramatic point of view, because they don't feel as bad because we actually see them. It's not the same thing where you let your own imagination fill in the gaps, and you let your own imagination work against you and be the horror that you're afraid of, rather than show us a scene where Ramsay's torturing a guy because, that's dramatic and scary. It's cheap, and it's redundant, and it's boring, and it's repulsive. And this season is littered with shit like that as well. You have freaking Meryn Trant, who, on top of being a huge asshole, is also a pedophile, because why the fuck not? And then let's have this horribly brutal scene where Arya stabs both of his eyes out. I mean, that scene is supposed to be in Winds of Winter, where she kills Raph the Sweetling, which is which is completely different. She stabs him like in the stomach a few times. Not this horribly brutal thing. She just stabs him in the eyeballs and then slits his throat very slowly, and just it's so much gore for no reason. It's shock value. Again, it's to make us think, oh, whoa, this is dramatic and shocking. Dramatic and shocking violence. Violence has to be used properly in a show. It has to be used in like anything. It has to be used very, very specifically. No violence is bad. Too much violence is bad. There's just like the right amount of violence. You know, violence when the Mountain kills Oberyn Martell, that's good, because that scene would be violent. Violence during the Red Wedding, that makes sense. Violence that is just unnecessary, where Arya is trying to kill Meryn Trant, is totally and utterly pointless. I mean, keep in mind, she was toying with him, right? This is like the same type of thing with the Viper fighting the Mountain. What if he had grabbed her and just like, and just choked her? He could have done that. He's easily stronger than her. He could have easily overpowered her. Even if he was blind, he could have looked around with his arms, grabbed her leg, tripped her, and then easily killed her. Because he can do that. That's not hard. Arya in that scene would have been trying to kill him as fast as she could. She would have been trying to murder him rather than toy with him. Making him blind doesn't automatically make him not dangerous. This sounds like a nitpick, but it's just it is a nit. I will admit that it is a nit, but it's one of the many nits that this show has had. Right? The fact that they even made the guy a pedophile is just so bleak that it pisses me off, right? Because Game of Thrones, the books, were not bleak. They were dark, they weren't afraid to be dark, and they were pretty horrifying, but they were never bleak. They were never like non-stop horror and violence every freaking scene. Bleak. Which brings me to Stannis. Whew. Stannis. So, Stannis is, by the book, pretty much until he starts marching on to Winterfell, where Ramsay's 20 good men somehow simultaneously light fires throughout the entire camp, which is impossible. Then Stannis proceeds to send Davos away, murder Shireen, leading to the murder of his own wife, and then Melisandre runs off because she's obviously realizes, oh, he's not Azor Ahai. And then he still marches on Winterfell, horribly outnumbered, gets destroyed, and then probably dies due to Brienne. The number of things that don't make sense in that whole arc are almost uncountable. For one, there wasn't even that much snow on the ground. They weren't even in that bad of a situation. People have talked about this. I don't even want to address it, honestly. People who have read the books universally hated the scene where he burns Shireen. Pretty much universally. There's very few people that actually like the thing. And I've read comments on YouTube, and some of them are pretty bad. There's one comment that was pretty horrifying. There's someone who said that, good, now all the psychological weaklings can go away and leave only the true show watchers, or something like that. He basically referred to all the people who didn't like the scene as psychological weaklings. Well, the argument there is obviously that the more brutal and the more violent that something is in the scene makes it better and more dramatic, right? As we all know that the more brutal and the more violent something is, the better it is. So let's just make something brutal and violent. Let's just make a movie that's just brutal violence nonstop. A splatter movie, right? That by that logic, that would be the best kind of movie. Of course it's not, because those movies are shit and they don't make any money. And they have low budgets. Violence does not equate to quality. Horror and drama, and pretty much making bad things happen, also doesn't equate to quality. There's a whole bunch of reasons why Stannis would not have killed Shireen. In the books, there's basically no way he would even get to her, to kill her. She's not there. In the books, he also wouldn't do it because that's not in his character. He's not that type of person. He cares a lot more about justice than he does about ambition. He might be willing to kill Renly, who is in open rebellion against him, who's a criminal, He might be willing to kill a bastard like Edric Storm because Edric Storm is a bastard. Who gives a shit? He's not going to kill Shireen, who, on top of being totally innocent of anything, is his own daughter, who he spent like years trying to cure and all this money trying to bring maesters to try and cure her of her disease. He's not just going to kill her. In fact, he's fighting for her. Part of the reason he's fighting to get on the Iron Throne is to put her on the Iron Throne as his only heir. I mean, the only other option he has, and his wife is barren. She can't bear other children. So the only other option for him getting on the throne and having an heir would be to murder both his wife and his daughter, and then get another wife, which is so out of character for Stannis. That is something a sociopath would do, and Stannis is not a sociopath. I find it very hard to believe, just the premise, that someone who loves their child could ever kill their child. I think that's not in human nature. That's out of human genetic nature. The only people who would do that are crazy people and sociopaths, and Stannis was neither. He's someone who cared a lot about justice. He's someone who cared a lot about, sort of the law. He was not someone who would murder his wife to get another wife to have a child for him. The Stannis in the show is sort of shown to be a lot more ambitious, but even the Stannis in the show loved his daughter. It feels out of character, even in the show. In the books, it's totally out of character, because he says, I'm not going to burn anyone anymore, and he even sends a guy back to base saying, look, put Shireen on the throne if I die in this battle. He was fighting for Shireen. If Shireen's dead, he doesn't even have a reason to be king anymore. I mean, I guarantee you that if Shireen dies within Winds of Winter, and Stannis somehow survives the story, then he's not going to be king. He's going to give up being king because part of the reason he was fighting, which was his daughter, isn't there anymore. Surprise, surprise, Stannis actually loves his daughter. He's not going to murder her. The only circumstance in which I can imagine him murdering her would be if there's 1,000 White Walkers swarming over the wall, and he has nothing else to do, and he needs King's blood to stop them. Maybe then he would murder Shireen. But that's a much more severe situation. It's not a case like this where, it's his own destruction that he's risking, and the destruction of his men, not the destruction of the entire realm. The stakes aren't as high within the battle to the north. So it's just, Stannis, the Stannis in the books is definitely the type of Stannis who would give up being king if it meant saving his daughter. He's not this power-hungry lunatic that would do this. And, as well, Selyse's reaction hardly makes any sense either. She seems more the type who would murder her own child because she seems genuinely crazy, unlike Stannis. And she ends up killing herself, and his men end up disbanding. It's weird how Stannis didn't see any of this coming, right? It's also weird how Davos didn't see it coming, didn't try to rescue Shireen, but it's especially weird how Stannis didn't see Selyse killing herself, he didn't see his men disbanding after he murders his own child. It's weird how he didn't see all the other consequences of this happening. He just banked on the fact that Mel told him, the Lord of Light will help you. But what does that actually mean? Is the Lord of Light gonna melt the snow, or is the Lord of Light gonna win him the battle? Those are two different things. So why he would even choose to do that on the chance that he would win the fight and end up becoming king, on the 5%, 50%, whatever tiny percentage chance that he had of winning, why he would risk why he would literally exchange his daughter's life for a chance, I don't freaking know. As we all know, this whole situation isn't going to happen in the books. We know that the idea to burn her was George R. R. Martin's, but what that actually means is totally up in the air. Maybe it was George R. R. Martin's idea to have her die in the show, maybe it's his idea to have her die in the books as well, but if it is, it'll be via a different circumstance. It'll be via Melisandre killing her to bring Jon Snow back to life, or it'll be when there's White Walkers coming over the wall and he has nothing else to do. It's not going to be when he can't get to her and when he literally doesn't want her to die as he's marching on Winterfell. Also, that whole Winterfell situation is really weird. I find it hard to believe that Bolton was going to win that fight, given that there were people within Bolton's camp that were going to rebel against him in the books. So I honestly don't know if the show is canon anymore at all. If anything is canon, if Stannis is supposed to lose that fight or if he's supposed to win. I mean, the fact is he has access to Theon, who is someone who took Winterfell before with just a few guys and knows how to sneak into Winterfell. So this could easily be the opportunity for Stannis to use some kind of white Trojan horse tactic and sneak into Winterfell and kill people inside and open the gates and then, win. And then Davos could come back with Rickon. It's just, I find it hard to believe that this whole situation is going to transpire as it did in the books, in the show. It's very unlikely. Then we have Dany. Dany's plot was okay, I guess. It was dramatic. She meets Tyrion, which is way ahead of where the books are. She meets Jorah, who is probably going to have more of a role in the show than he will in the books. The only thing wrong with it was the Sons of the Harpy. The Sons of the Harpy are untrained military men. Sorry, they're not military men. They are completely untrained. They are just random-ass people who live in Meereen who have access to knives. Their ability to fight one-on-one with Unsullied is so unbelievable pathetic. The Unsullied are basically stormtroopers within this season. They let Barristan Selmy die. Brown Ben Plum almost dies. No, not Brown Ben Plum. What's his name? Grey Worm almost dies. They almost let Daenerys die at the Marine fight pits. They're useless, which is stupid because they're supposed to be incredibly good at fighting because they've been training their whole lives. Not to mention the fact that if you're a spearman and you're fighting a guy with a knife, you will win 100% of the time. Spears beat knives, people. Spears are very effective weapons, as evidenced by all of the wars that happened back during the Greek times. Spears and phalanxes are very effective ways of fighting people. And then we have Jorah Connington. And they're amalgamating that character. It's just, there's too much shit that's being cut out. And there's too much relevant stuff that's being cut out, is the idea. The Iron Men, of course, were completely cut out and probably aren't going to show up again. I think chances are they're not going to show up even in Season 6 or 7. I think they're just completely forgotten. And that's kind of sad because the Iron Men were some of the coolest characters in the books, which is why a lot of people were disappointed that they were cut out. So what's going to happen there is honestly unknown. It sort of makes the show, if this happens, that they get cut out completely, it makes the show really shitty. Because it sets up all these plots and all these characters that it does nothing with. Remember, Balon Greyjoy was in the show, and so was Asha. And so was their whole kingdom, but they don't do anything, right? Where is their stake within the show's story? Where are the Brotherhood Without Banners? What is Dorne's role in the story? I mean, if important characters who have a lot to do with how the show ends up ending are getting cut out, and have a lot to do with the fate of certain characters are getting cut out, then it's kind of weird, because if you cut out characters that have a lot to do with the fate of certain characters, then you ultimately change the fate of certain characters, which is what happens to Jaime and Brienne. And it's probably going to happen to more characters as well. It's probably happened to Stannis already, because they've cut out a whole bunch of characters that couldn't affect Stannis. Is Rickon and Osha still in the show? Is Rickon and Osha going to come back, or is that just they just forgot about those two as well? Because maybe they forgot about them. I honestly don't know. There's so many other plots going on that for the show to end, it would have to cut out a lot of stuff. One of my friends actually hypothesized that it would be a good idea if the show ended as a movie, because a movie could get a movie budget and actually give the ending justice, and have like a 2-hour or 3-hour movie or whatever, where the grand finale of Game of Thrones is actually showcased. That would have been great, and that would actually be a good idea, I think, because then it would at least get the visual aspect of adaptation down, let alone the politics aspect and the just the nonsensical aspect of cutting out a plethora of characters. People who haven't read the books, you really don't know what you're missing at this point. There is so much that they have cut out. There's literally hundreds of characters. The fact that three of the main characters, no, not three, four, Mel, Davos, Stannis, Brienne, and Jaime, five characters at least, are completely off book at this point. Oh, and Sansa, completely off book. Off book to the point of no return. Shows something. It shows just how far off the show has gone. And of course you might think, okay, well you're just an angry fanboy that read the books. Well, the thing is, there is so much within this show that is lost because it's not following the books. Right? For one, a lot of people talk about how Game of Thrones is it's not a very high fantasy setting. It's a pretty low fantasy setting. It's very realistic, gritty, and there's not that much use of fantasy elements like magic. But see, the thing is, that isn't true. There is a lot of magic within this setting. It's just more subtle magic. There's very little overt magic, like people don't throw fireballs at other people, but there's lots of prophecies, there's lots of dreams that people have that are prophetic, there's lots of magic that affects certain things happening in weird ways. There's the idea of fate and destiny and all that stuff is going on. And a lot of that stuff there's a whole magic mystery thing going on as well. The idea that there's no magic in the setting is kind of ridiculous. If anything, magic plays an enormous role in the way that the setting plays out and the way that it turns out. Magic and prophecy. It's prophetic magic, if anything. It's divination, if you read Harry Potter. So this element is completely lost, though, because you just see it all happening as just a very gritty human story. The only difference between most fantasy in this is that this is a human story. There's no dwarves, there's no elves, there's very little other fantasy creatures. It's just humans and there's dragons, and that's basically it. Anywho. The conclusion this... I'm sorry if this sounded like a rant. I did like episode 8 this season. I liked the episode where they had the Stradholm, whatever the name of the place that Jon Snow goes to, and they have that fight with the Whites. I like that because despite not making any sense, despite Jon Snow shouldn't have even been there, it was cool. It was really goddamn cool. It was well designed. They had a whole shot. They had a very long shot that followed Jon as he was running through the battlefield. They had him fight a White Walker and win, which was great. They had a very dramatic scene where the Night's King, raises all the people from the dead. It was very exciting, which is exactly what you can do with an adaptation. Is you can take visuals. You can do stuff like that. You can go off book and take something that wasn't in the book, but add it in because of its visual elements, because it looks freaking cool and it's like a battle and stuff. But that is the only time they did that, because that's the only time they could do that, because they have no budget. The only other time they did that was, of course, in the very ending with Cersei, I think. Anyway, you get the point. And the point I'm going to make here, right at the end, and this is the indictment on the whole show, but honestly, this doesn't deserve to be a show. The books do not deserve to be a television show. The only reason I'm even still watching the show, honestly, is because I want to find out what happens in the story, because I know that the show is going into the books, and Dream of Spring isn't going to be completed by the time... It's not going to be completed by the time that Season 7 comes out. But honestly, this doesn't deserve to be a show, because it doesn't do either of the two things that an adaptation is supposed to do. It's not a visual story, by any means. Nowhere near enough, nowhere near to the point that it should be, as a visual story as the book suggests it should be. It's not a politics story either, because it cuts out a plethora of characters, and it cuts out a plethora of plot lines that are very relevant to the story. and to the point where things literally don't make sense as well. It doesn't deserve to be a show at that point, and I guarantee it that it's going to get worse. This is my projection, and maybe I'm just a cynic, and maybe I'm just a pissed off fanboy, but I guarantee you the show is going to get worse in season 6, and even worse in season 7. And unless they have a huge budget, or unless they do the movie thing, it's going to end in a very disappointing way. That might precipitate a lot of people to go read the books. One of my friends who didn't want to read the books at all has even suggested or thought about maybe reading the books because of what's happening in the show, and that right there is proof. This is a guy who hates reading, and he might even read the books. The point is, the books are the story. The show is a bastardized version of the story, and there's really no way around that. And honestly, this wouldn't even be an issue. This wouldn't even be such a bad thing if George R. R. Martin could write a goddamn book and would stop doing interviews and all this other shit that he's doing so he could just finish a goddamn book. I think Winds of Winter is supposed to be like 2,000 pages long. The problem with George R. R. Martin is that this whole story is not self-contained. It is not split up into self-contained parts, right? Like, it's not split up. It's not a trilogy. It's just a very long series of books. Each one flows directly into the next book without cut off. It basically forces you to need to read the next book as soon as you finish the requisite book. As soon as you finish Dance, you want to read Winds of Winter, but you can't get to it because you have to wait 3 years for him to write the goddamn thing. It's a huge disappointment, right? Because it follows directly. I think like Winds of Winter is supposed to pick up 5 minutes after Dance finishes off. There's something wrong with that model. If fans have to wait for years to find out the next 5 minutes of what happens, there's something very annoying about that. I think this whole entire story would have fared a lot better as a fan fiction, for the fans obviously, as a fan fiction where the guy releases chapters. Like, I don't mean it's a fan fiction. I mean it's presented in the way that fan fiction is, where it's a few chapters released every few weeks or whatever, and people can read it, and the story gets advanced every once in a while, rather than having to wait for years to find out everything. It's like, it's just the biggest, it's just the most annoying thing. Like, people who have, you watch the show, you might be waiting for season 6, but if you read the books, I swear to God, you cannot wait for Winds of Winter to get here. You will want to read the next book a lot more than you will want to wait for the next season. You know, at least in something like Malazan Book of the Fallen, you know, every book is more or less self-contained, and the story is more or less self-contained. Anyway, having these inconclusive storytelling structure is really anti-fan. It's really kind of anti-consumer in a way. That was my rant. Again, I don't have, there's not very much positive to say. I said what's positive there. I like Jon Snow's part of the story. Jon Snow's part was by the book, and very good, more or less. And I like Cersei's ending, and that was it. That was the only stuff that felt in character and that felt accurate. Everything else either didn't make any sense or was out of character. And that's basically the direction in which we're headed. So stay tuned until season 6, where things probably get a heck of a lot worse. The ultimate thing is, though, it's not about being a fanboy, it's just about the fact that this is an adaptation of a very intricate story. If you know the intricate story, then you are going to be attached to the intricate story. And for that reason, the show is not going to be up to par. Guarantee it. The only exception might be people who have watched the show first, then read the books, because those guys might actually might actually interpret it differently because they watched the show first and feel a little attached to the show. People who read the books are a little attached to the books. I don't know. I'm trying to be reasonable here and not go into either extreme. I'm not saying the show is terrible. I never said that. I never said the show is a net negative. It's still a net positive in terms of television. It's still way better than most of the shows that are out there, I'd say. But it's not in the sort of net zero category. It's the category right above that. But it's kind of the same problem that I have with House of Cards. These shows are hyped like crazy, but they are not in the top category of television or film or anything. And that all that I'm noticing is the disappointment is because it's going downhill. Anyway, I'm going to try not to be a cynic about this anymore. I'd be a lot more positive if I talked about the books, because the books are really great, and there's a lot of really cool fan theories out there about what's going to happen in Winds of Winter, but the show, it's kind of going downhill, and I think even people who are aware of people who watch the show and don't read the books are also aware of this. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say. I hope it gets better. I doubt that it will. When Winds of Winter comes out though, there's going to be a huge sigh of relief from a lot of fans. And I just can't wait till that happens in 2016, so I have a whole year to go. Anyway, it's about it. Cheers.